Hi, welcome back to Spiritual Intelligence. At this time, topic arose that was just of personal importance to me. Sometimes you have these insights during the week, like how much of a noob you are. And that word now sounds so probably millennial that if a Gen Z hears noob, I wonder, I don't do online gaming anymore, but I wonder what they use now.
A good question.
Right?
It's still a word. Yeah, it's definitely same generation, I guess.
It sounds like you're some dirty old man saying, nope, okay, you're not cool anymore, uncle. Please go to your PC. I'll play with my Switch 2 or whatever. No, the cool kids, I guess, use Sony. I don't know. Anyways, the topic was indeed the noise inside and how it's pretty much, at least in my case, I observed it correlates a lot to the noise outside and how much of a need you have to drown it out. Because I appreciate stillness in general, like sensory stillness, right? And sometimes it's very irritating to not have it. But that irritation, while being an expectation, also comes from the fact that you're trying to look outside instead of looking inside. What does that mean? Even if the world is completely at peace, you would hear the noise inside, right? And what happens with societies, at a spectrum, at least with most societies, is noise has been normalized. And seeking out noise has also been normalized. And when you see the pathology of it, it is usually this way to not hear. And why wouldn't you want to hear? Because for a monk and for all these spiritual descriptions, it's okay, yeah, you sit in stillness and stillness reaches you. But it doesn't. If you sit in stillness, you just hear more noise. And that noise is not something you can modulate. So the way you modulate is by making more noise outside.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I also consider noise to be part of life. So I remember we both did read this book, The Mind Illuminated, back then by Culadasa. It was the Buddhist teacher. It's about Buddhist meditation. And it's a meditation technique that is probably quite classical in the Buddhist sense, to focus your attention on the breath. And then you will realize how noisy your mind is and how difficult it is to focus your mind on a singular point. It couldn't be at the tip of your nose or anywhere in the body. But you will notice how difficult this is. You might not be able to hold your attention. Maybe just now they go on into the later stages, you might be able to concentrate better. Then you might be still able to focus on a singular point. But then there's this meta awareness where you're still able to see your inner voice, right? But this is something I did for some time, but I switched gears, you could say. And now these days, I'm much more comfortable or just accept the noise as it is in there. Right? And it's not something I try to suppress. However, when we speak of noise, it's interesting, how could this be defined? So what is this noise anyway? Is it thoughts? Is it parts of your mind? Are we talking about maybe emotions? That's a juicy one. And then the question is also, what is it that we might try to avoid? Very often there is very likely some avoidance pattern going on. So when we don't like or at least some part of ourselves doesn't like what it hears or what's trying to message you from the inside, right? And this is interesting, definitely, to observe. And yeah, I'm curious just how you experience it and what kind of noise are you experiencing these days?
So as you said, in a sense, if I don't really pay attention to it, it's a mess. It's like a knot, a contraction, right? And it causes irritation. But now, because I have had this opportunity to observe and train it over the years, I like Shinzen's model of experience, which is, for him, Shinzen Young, he divided sensory experience in three paths: see, hear, and feel. And it's pretty much as it sounds, right? Like you have, and he also divides extra outer experience and inner experience. Making that distinction means that see, hear, feel, external, it's as easy as it gets. You see an image, right now you open your eyes, you have whatever in front of you is there, and you see something. Then you hear something with your ears pretty much, and you feel something with your body, that also a little bit with emotions. But when it comes to outer, it's only your body. Like you're cold, you're hot. And then for the inner world, it's images. When you see an image on your mental screen. And that one, it may be abstract for some, but it may be different for everyone, how they see it. But pretty much anyone can understand, I think, when they see an image, when they see a memory, it's something that doesn't exist in front of you, somewhere in your head, somewhere in the screen of reality. Then you have hearing, which is voices. If you also observe your mind, there are some voices talking to you. Some words come up, some voices of people or memories come up. For me, it's also like that. And then you have feeling, which now becomes internal somatic judgment-based feeling. This feels bad, fear, anxiety, anger, etc., 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 like the big boys. So although you could probably simplify to good and bad. And now, in this model, sometimes I feel everything at the same time, and that's when it's more uncomfortable usually. But I can separate. Sometimes it's voices, sometimes it's images. Most of the time, it's abstract images that cause a feeling. And then there's a comment on top of it. That's like my usual order. But it's all mixed. Now, also in Shinzen's model, when you separate them, when you are able to, like, in any moment, see them as separate concepts, you automatically take away a lot of the strength and polarity of it. Because what you're doing is using your mental capacity to not make them multiply. And it's very obvious, to be honest, because if I see a turd on the street and I already like just see it, then there's no more more sensory experience adding to it. I'm not commenting, I'm not thinking about it, etc. But right away it will happen. You will think it stinks, you will think you will step on it, you will think who did this, you will feel embarrassed or angry or judgmental because someone didn't clean up his dog poo. And then you're adding. And he says you're multiplying, right? And it's the same for everything. If someone calls you a bad word right away, if someone insults you, what happens? You just feel it right away, usually. But if you have these little spaces, see that there's an order. You hear the word, and interpretations come up, an image comes up, then maybe a voice inside your head repeats it again at you with another tone, maybe with the tone of your high school bully or your boss or whatever, or your mom who also used to call you that. Then it feels the feeling. Then the feeling hits the voice again. And it's a little circus where everyone is just punching, like disturbing each other until it becomes a little fire. And that's it pretty much. The only problem is that you or I or probably anyone that has a super trained mind, it happens so automatically and you don't have the resources to be like, okay, in this circus, what's happening? Which monkey is poking which monkey, man? And it's pretty much like the emojis with the monkeys. So good that they did that. See, here, I don't see, I don't hear, I don't, which one is the other one? And it's like that. The monkey that hears, the monkey that feels, the monkey that speaks. Yeah, that's how I see it, how I try to see it sometimes. Because honestly, just like anyone else, I still have automatic conditioned patterns. And what I notice is they reflect in some sort of contraction or anxiety around the chest. And I also have to fight the urge not to distract myself by a pleasure or distraction or whatever. Or I'm not the type to fight. Sometimes you really want to fight with something, someone. And it's this. You just don't want to stay with this noise.
Yeah, I think almost no one is immune to that. And even I would like to see Shinzen when he steps into, I don't know, into some piece of shit, or if he's getting angry or so. There was a joke, I think Rupert Spira said this. There was a Zen master and his wife. And so someone asked his wife, okay, since when is your husband enlightened? And then the wife said, okay, he's not enlightened. If you knew him, you would know he's not enlightened, or something like that, right? Just there's like this outer show or a public facade versus what people claim. Obviously, there are several attainments, and sure, some people, they have really a very highly trained mind, and they spend their whole lives doing so. On the other hand, I have a lot of compassion especially with myself first and foremost, if there is some automatic reaction, because otherwise it would be a sort of judgment, judging the natural emotions that are there anyway. If we have compassion with that little monkey creature, and we better not judge it because it is its nature. And let's say anger is coming up and you might explode and you might say things you might regret even later. But even then, it is what it is. And judging it makes it somewhat worse, and it will probably bubble up in the future again because it wasn't really healed. So there was something in there that wanted to express itself. And even if it's just some frozen child from childhood that did throw anger tantrums because for whatever psychological reasons, right? So that might be the only reason it got attention from the parents, for instance, that there was no other way of getting so. And maybe this pattern has survived through its adulthood. Whatever it is, there can be a countless different things. In the end, giving the emotion some expression, that's the first thing I personally try to do, to really have compassion with that and also with all the noise inside. The mind is a very complex thing. Everyone was handed one, but not really a manual and not really a skillful way to handle it. And what I liked, there's Adyashanti, who is this spiritual teacher. He said something very nice, which I liked, is that healing comes really from feeling your emotions. So you really express yourself, and that's the first there, to heal it in a sense, to give expression. Because if we don't invite the emotions that are there, suppress them in a certain way or judging them, then will only strengthen avoidance patterns that will then lead to some sort of pressure cooker. And the pressure cooker can only hold so much pressure until it explodes, right? So there's a physical limit to it, you could say. But on the other hand, I like what you said about the screen of realities. There's all kinds of stuff coming up, right? There are thoughts, external things, internal things. And it's indeed, some seem to be more joyful, others seem to be more negative, in quotation marks. And this is probably also has evolutionary reasons. So the joyful things are probably good for us, for the survival of the species. The bad ones also serve a purpose technically. But of course, it is when you are inside of those emotions, it is extremely difficult to them in. And so obviously there's a spectrum, right? So there's maybe this background that is there with all kinds of components to it. There's thinking and there's somatic components and there are emotions, and probably some of them we want to repress and then we want to distract ourselves just not to feel them. And then this can go all the way up to maybe some deep trauma or deep patterns that fuck up your life. So there is a full spectrum of those. And obviously then this depends really how much suffering causes this ultimately. So that's for me the main practical question. So there's always background noise. Probably everyone has it. It's more or less normal. But how much of this is really deep suffering? So what of this requires healing? And what is something that requires acceptance? So that's for me how I try to think about this. And I think everyone has components that probably could use a little bit of healing. If I want to use this maybe slightly overused word. On the other hand, there are probably some, in other cases, there's nothing to fix, I can imagine. So no, not sure if you see it similar.
It's quite interesting because we land on this topic a lot, and it's like the technique-based feeling of Shinzen, and it's unified mindfulness, I think they call it like that, gives you something to do, which is again cool, but then there's the thing of you're doing something. There is nothing to do. You should just feel, just be, right? And in the to-do model, you're like trying to dissect, to control sometimes, but not just to be with that. However, it is quite nuanced because what you're trying to do is imagine how a bird, like we have animals and we are all animals with different reflexes and times and reflex rates pretty much in how we see things. Like when we move, what's fast for us, it's not fast for a cat and it's not fast for a hummingbird. When we hear, and this is a perfect example, we hear the song of a bird singing, and to us it sounds like a melody maybe, and of like that lasts 1 second with a crescendo, and that's it. When a bird hears it, they hear maybe 10 times more as us, and the sound moves, and because they can, in a sense, expand this time, because their input is taking more input. Like a cat is the same. That's why they can hit a snake and we will just sit there and get bitten by the snake. They are seeing more frames of reality. And so what we are trying to do is that also, in a sense. When you sit there, if you could see more frames, like in a video game, theoretically you can shoot the enemy in the video game before they react. And we're trying to see this little chain reaction, what starts it and what are the components. Because sometimes we're very blind to it. It's like, this happens, I feel this, I hear this, and the reaction immediately, I'm almost immediately angry. Some people are already almost punching the other person, right? Or like doing whatever, or judging or feeling bad. The body immediately changes. And the body is always a reflection. Maybe you hear that and immediately your heart rate increases and your arms get tense, your neck, etc. So the first step in accepting is also knowing what you're accepting, right? And this is with the nuances. Sometimes you really need to fall back on that technique so you can even have that space to be like Adyashanti says, with the emotion. Because sometimes it's so hard to be with an emotion, not because it's so strong, just because the conditional response is so fast that you won't even have time to analyze it, to be with the whole chain. You just will be with the consequences. And theoretically, you want to start observing it as soon as possible. And when you were saying that about, it's always about childhood, it is interesting that when you have the opportunity to observe children, and especially when you have children, the very young ones, I don't know, 1, 2, 3 years old, especially 2 years old, they are like pure expression of needs and emotion. If you allow them, they just, if they feel intimidated by someone, they just show it. If they are sad, if they throw a tantrum, they just show it. They're not really concerned about an interpretation or a layer of filter on top of that. For us, I noticed that as an adult, depending on your relationship to your emotion, you have different relationship to the emotion of children, especially your children. Other children, not really, because they're other children, but you could get angry because a child is crying in the plane, right? And it's inconvenient. Like I realize sometimes you feel this, oh, why can't they control or box their emotions a little bit or just flatten them? Why do they have to be so extreme and so selfish in a sense that they don't care about others? They will cry. Doesn't matter if it's the party, if it's the wedding, if it's the funeral. A child will do what a child does because it's their need expressed without worry, without thinking about others. And that's where it starts, because you notice that you as an adult want to give a framework for this instead of just letting a child explain, because this is what I do with myself, right? With myself, I may be like, yeah, you shouldn't feel sad, you should reframe it, or etc. You should, right? Or, oh, let's fix this. Yeah, it's just a feeling, let's do something to fix it. Again, fixing the noise, right? Drowning it out. And you start teaching these patterns were usually also taught to you. So you're repeating them, the ones that work, the ones that you have used for a lifetime. And again, you don't see the chain reaction. So if you don't even see the chain reaction inside, you automatically start seeing it out. You could see it outside, right? Okay, I feel this and I try to force this on the others. Since a child doesn't have defenses yet or a structured pattern, you just teach them yours, right? If you were taught to hold them up, like you're a man, you shouldn't cry, you should behave, you should be productive, then that's what you will teach them, right? Redirect your emotion. It's a cool thing, like you should redirect your emotion, your frustration, you should try again, whatever. But you're already teaching something on top of this pure emotion. And this is what leads to this pressure cooker sometimes, because does it have an outlet? Because there is a time and place for things. We are adults and we have the ability to sometimes close the pressure cooker. Yeah, it's not time for this emotion. We're not childs anymore in this sense. It's going to happen still inside of you. Like even if you say it won't, it's happening in the background. Okay, it gets drowned out, right? It gets added to the pressure cooker. But what comes next? Where do you unbottle all of this? And where do you pour them out? It's like thinking that when you wash water down the drain, it has to go somewhere, right? And all this piping, you don't see it, but someone planned it so that it can have an enough outlet to let it go. Else it would explode all in shit when it rains, right? It happens in some cities because of bad planning. And it's the same for you. You don't really have a whole system. So you teach an incomplete system to a child that it might not even fit them because you don't even have that usually handled yourself. So yeah, that's how I see it. So in the end, it's again like you're doing something, you shouldn't be doing something, you should accept it, but you don't know how to accept it. And you mentioned that like are not taught how. We're actually taught how not to do it. So that's the contradiction.
Yeah. I think this gets inherited, exactly as you said. And especially if the parents themselves, they might be emotionally closed off and they might judge the child. So the judgment and the contractions of the parents get inherited by the children and they don't know any better, right? So they absorb this as a sponge and then will lead to other avoidance patterns of the child just given from the parents. And they don't know any better. And then the child carries this into adulthood and then it's a cycle. And they might then again pass this on to their children, right? So this is the cycle that returns, that it continues. And how do you break this pattern? I think sometimes it is never broken. It's not so that automatically at one point all the toxic poison gets released. It's exactly as you said, the mind has the ability to control and suppress toxic stuff inside, toxic patterns, because this avoidance pattern helps them to survive. And maybe they are able to participate in society, do their jobs, but the internal poison is still there and it never really found an outlet. This is the work that potentially needs to be done. And the first step for that is, are you yourself aware that you have this inside of yourself? That's the first step. If someone doesn't even know this themselves, because they're suppressing it, they're not open to it, they don't have the self-awareness to it. And how could they, right? So you don't know what you don't know because your whole life, this is how you operated. Then I'm not sure how this can be healed. There is a sort of grace to it, I would say. You might maybe stumble upon this podcast, although what are the odds that someone who's extremely deep into some trauma, now that they stumble onto this podcast here. So one path could be they try to reduce their suffering because there will be suffering coming up in subtle ways where we might manipulate stuff that might be detrimental to us, where we hinder our progress, and they might then search for solutions to the problem. So that's what the mind usually does. It tries to find a solution. That's the first step, right? But sometimes the mind does not even try to solve for the solution. It just does what it ever does. So it doesn't grow necessarily. It might even degrade and strengthen its own patterns to its detriment. So that there are very extreme cases where, the mind might even try to end itself, right? So it's unfortunately, not always a happy ending. But I would say once you have the self-awareness of this, that's the first step. And then you can actually access parts inside of you, like really your source, capital S self, the source consciousness, which is in fact very peaceful. So you might turn your attention inwards and observe what is actually here inside, what is exactly here right now. And there is a certain perspective from which you can observe this stuff with compassion. You can invite this, right? So you don't judge it. But if you don't have this capability yet, or you have not unlocked this, then it could also be helpful just to find someone who helps you on this journey, right? Maybe to hold space for you. That could be part of it. Say, who's so deep into it and has so much suffering, it might not be possible for them to say, okay, just read Rumi's Guest House and invite and welcome your emotions. It sounds all good, and I think it's correct. But some people might not be there yet, right? It might be too difficult, or there's too much protective tissue, too many barriers inside to uncover. So there are too many protectors in your mind that will not let you go to the pieces that actually need the healing, right? The compassion and the love that's required to heal that. Now, in this particular case, then you need to negotiate with the patterns of your mind that might be open, because they also want to be respected. though those patterns that do not want to be crushed or destroyed. So this is how I think about this. There always needs to be an angle of compassion and understanding, even to the parts of you where you judge them that they might be detrimental. So you might judge yourself like, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I messing up my life? But those parts, they want to play their role. And the first step for me is really trying to understand. So having a certain understanding to it. But an interesting topic in itself is the role of grace. So how do you stumble or go into this path, more self-awareness and more self-healing? And I think there's just a part of the population who might be partially attracted to such things. And they might be interested in hearing what we are talking about. But not everyone, of course. And the annoying part could be that they might be so contracted that their behavior might be danger to yourself or to others. In the end, it's all ignorance, and everyone has maybe some wounded parts inside. But the problem is if those wounds are so deep and they cause so much suffering, then this suffering bleed out onto others. And the worst extreme case, like in those fantasy science fiction stories, then they might want to destroy the world, because in the end they want to probably get rid of the pain inside, and there's just a crying child inside. It just wants to have a little bit of love, but you might not be able to reach it. So, but yeah, that's definitely an interesting point. Maybe just one last point. It's very interesting. I was also thinking about this. So Shinzen Young, so his approach seems to be like what you said. It's really about increasing the resolution, the sampling rate of perception of reality. So you see every single frame of reality. And when you see it at that resolution, then even suffering or fear or anger could potentially lose its power, its grip over you, because you see it in high resolution. Now, the other part is, or the other angle to it is, you might not need the superpower of perception. You just accept the integrated final piece, right? So there's not necessarily lots of detail, because you immediately have access to your source consciousness or your source self. And from its perspective, it just invites everything that's in there. So it doesn't matter for it if you have like fine-grained resolution of all the components. It's just one blurry mess, maybe. But even this mess will be loved. It's just an interesting thought about those two different approaches.
I was thinking about it, like, how do you know that you have the ability? You mentioned it as grace, right? And the dry term for thinking about thinking is metacognition, right? You have at least the possibility to observe your thoughts from another perspective. Else, you're just completely identified with them. And while you were talking about this, how for some it's not enough to just say, yeah, you observe the Rumi poem, invite your emotions, because you feel a victim of your emotions. In the model where you can never observe the patterns, you're just completely identified in the trip, in the movie, then you act. There's no difference in between what you think, what you feel, what you do. And it's just unified, which sounds good to be unified, but then you're completely lost in the ocean, in the waves, right? In the other one, you're still getting in that little ship, and the ocean is, sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's hitting you, sometimes it's drowning your ship, sinking your ship, but you still can see the ocean as a whole, right? Or you remember that the ocean is there. And the other one, you're in this little cabin, just being buffeted by everything. So is this a gift that you're born with? Is this a gift that you acquire? And definitely you acquire it, but it never ends. Because when you think you see the ocean, then you realize you only see a pond, and then you realize that you don't see under the ocean, and then you realize that it's not even the ocean, maybe. And there's tentacles underneath trying to do hentai things to you. And so you start seeing all of this, right? And then the more you know, the more you don't know. That's always the freaking paradox. And with the only thing that I see with the Shinzen's approach is that it's a very good way to start when you feel all of this is too abstract and you don't have it, because it gives you a little instruction. I think anyone can be like, what do I hear? When do I hear a voice in my mind? And start just paying attention to that. And suddenly they're like, oh, there it is. There's a voice in my mind. Then there's the sense. Then there's the image, right? And it starts increasing the sample rate, as you say. Suddenly you don't have this shitty old monitor anymore. You have a 120 hertz monitor and you can snipe headshot your opponents in Counter-Strike of real life. But it still depends on you having a little bit of this metacognition. And is there a model where you don't have it? You can never see your thoughts. You're completely dumb in the sense of this type of intelligence. And you're like a little animal and you just react. I think there is examples of people that still behave like Neanderthals from specific cultures and backgrounds. Maybe they don't have it. But I would say that almost everyone in a normal spectrum of intelligence could have access to it just by having this little entry door. And the problem with just accepting something, as Adja says, is that it's so like a string of stuff, right? Feeling, images, memories, body sensations. And it can be like a complete ball of mud covered in things. Can be too much to digest at the time, right? And so trying to separate it is just a way to make bandwidth higher. Like if you don't have the bandwidth, you just send little packets like the internet, right? You just send the voice first. You don't send the whole 4K, 8K video trauma into your home theater, into your little screen, right? You just send a little bit, a horror movie. You send maybe an audio message, then an image, then a little bit, then a GIF, then a mid-spin GIF, whatever. And then you start increasing the resolution because now you can handle more, right? And maybe that's what everyone has to find out for themselves and just keep increasing the bandwidth. One of the purposes of his paths is there is many paths. He also has this do nothing or just be in the background or hold the things in the background mode, which corresponds to certain philosophies or practices. However, there is the point of this is you would take, as you said, if you would take this resolution to the maximum possibility that you can, the point is that you see that reality is being recreated every millisecond. It's infinite, right? There's a discrete, in a sense, we are here, we're thinking that there's a continuum of experience, but we are actually gluing discrete moments together. They're happening in a time slice, and our brains and our systems fill up the gaps between the movement and the end movement, and experience, the end experience. It applies to every sense. We just think it's continuous. Now, if you would take it under a microscope, you would see like the atoms are separated, and then you would see the electrons are spinning around the atoms, etc. And that's how you do the microscope on physical reality. But with the microscope of the senses, you would also realize that somehow experience is being created and being destroyed because you're observing it and you have stopped observing it. So it stops existing for you. So what do that imply? That would come to the conclusion of the Buddha, of permanence. Nothing is really there all the time. It's empty. You're just constantly recreating it, like the graphic cards, like the video game. It's like sending you a frame, sending you another frame. But if you pause between the frames, there would be nothing, right? At that moment, nothing was rendered or nothing was sent to your monitor. It couldn't render. You're just not seeing it, but you feel the gap. And if you had that experience so deep, so permanent, it definitely would completely destroy your illusion of the world being permanent, because you're like, fuck, all these things I see, they're being recreated, re-rendered, destroyed, garbage collected, every nano and half of nanosecond, whatever micro, what's the smallest amount of time possible.
The Planck time, also, right? So, yeah.
And then create it again. So what does that imply for my life and my suffering and all my bullshit? And that's why it can be one of those deep wake-up calls, like, holy shit, this is really, as they say, reality is nothing, it's not real. But that's just one type of practice. And in the end, all of them live to Rome, right?
This also is interesting. There's also this continuation of the self, of your identity, right? Imagine there is just this timeless now. There is not really time. There's just now happening. There's nothing else, really. What is this continuity anyway? There's the mind that has this concept of yourself that seems to persist throughout time. You might think you have lived already for so many years, but what does that even mean? So it's going back to the very simple question, what is here anyway, here, right now? It is always here and right now. And then it's interesting, there's also this, what the Buddha said, Everything is changing. Nothing is constant. Now, the only thing that's constant, that's actually interesting, is what is this thing, what is experiencing this, right? When you remember back when you were a child or now, and by the way, it's always now, this thing seems to be a constant, even though your body might change, and even this concept of yourself, right? And it's interesting to ponder, what is this thing you call yourself anyway? That's a really interesting thing. And I know it just in natural sciences and physics or so, I know that they have those models, and I remember that we're talking about those time slices. Or in relativity, you have those cones, those light cones, where the speed of light defines the space-time continuum where information or anything can travel. You can only remain inside there, right? And it's interesting in terms of quantum effects and classical field stuff, where they're talking about quantum gravity is one of those unsolved things in physics. And remember that we're talking about slices of time, right? And it is completely opposite of what the present moment experience is. So there are no slices of time. But on the other hand, this is actually interesting. What is the unit, the minimal unit of perception? This is a really interesting question. I don't really have a good answer to that. And I think Shinzen Young is really trying to increase that resolution. And then that's right. In the end, you will be able to see that things arise and things vanish into the void. And then what is here anyway to observe this, right? That's really interesting. If you really go inside and just have curiosity about what's happening here. And if you do this, first of all, there might be this natural curiosity. I think if curiosity drives this sort of exploration, that's the best case because you voluntarily do it. The idea is it pulls you towards that, trying to understand what's here. And you always have this opportunity. It can be anything. It can be trying to observe your body, trying to observe anything that's happening here. And all those sense gates that you might have. So yeah, those sense perceptions, maybe try to observe what is happening there. Not only visual, you might close your eyes or you open it, maybe in the acoustic, in all those sense dimensions. You can always arbitrarily go deep, but interestingly, it seems like this endless journey of, if you think of where your attention is focused on right now, it always shifts, right? It's just continuously shifting all the time. Some crazy light cone that goes in all directions and might be very erratic. But this is exactly what reality is experiencing right now. So this is the continuous change all the time. It's very interesting. So that's this contraction into this singular thing. You might focus on the breath or on the tip of your nose. And reality is right now focusing on exactly this. This is reality exactly right now. And from a certain perspective, that this is crazy that this is even happening. Why should it do this? Why would your nose be the totality of reality in existence? It's strange if you think about it. On the other hand, there are also those emotions, and we can observe them as well. But it's a really good point about what if someone is just lost in the stormy ocean, in the sea out there, and they don't have this metacognition or like this grace or whatever it is. So it's just they're in the movie. They don't know they're in the movie. They're just in the matrix, to use this maybe tainted word at this point already. What can you do about it? Probably nothing. It is just what it is. So this is where I see definitely grace being part of it. But on the other hand, there's certainly potential for everyone just trying to be a little bit more compassionate and being a little bit more observant if you're open to it in the end. In the end, it needs to come from within. And often it can be helpful because we're all in this game on this server. We spawn together and we're all trying to figure it out. And sometimes like a little hint from someone might unlock something in you. That's probably the biggest value of us talking about this and everyone talking about the thing. And there might be someone else influencing you in a kind of different direction. They say you are the average of the closest people you spend time with or something like that, right? And if the closest people are like the influence and all the content and ideas and everything that goes into your mind is garbage, what does this do to your mind? But what if it's healthy? What if it's like pure, healthy, lean and clean, full of nutrients? That probably is different than if you just were consuming processed garbage. And this is not true only for nutrition, of course, for everything, right? In the domain of ideas, in the domain of really trying to understand yourself. But obviously, everyone has a bias, so including us. So it's always important that, I guess it's a topic for another episode, really. Whom should you believe anyway? But always being able to be critical about advice anyway. But yeah, I like really this image of the stormy ocean, and you might have this little pocket of serenity, of peace inside, even though you might be submerged in water, but there's this little pocket, and this might be really the first step. You don't need to have a perfect peace all the time, but there's this little pocket, and then you might expand this little air bubble underwater, and it might be sufficient to let you breathe.
That's beautiful. The hope in all of this is, again, that while everything is already good if you accept it, there is more that you can see and do. So you have more peace and joy. In the end, all of this practice and all of these things, we shouldn't forget that they're supposed to make us feel better. Sometimes they make us feel worse for a while, but the end goal is to see things more as they are and to find the joy, the inherent joy in everything. And it's hard. It gets hard, yeah, especially when you're in a storm in the ocean. But yeah, it will pass. And also the hope of seeing more of these discrete points is that it's like a factory line of experiences and inputs, right? The factory line can go so fast that you wouldn't even be able to pick out the processed stuff because it sees going so fast. Maybe you just see a hot line of metal molted, but if you would have like higher resolution, you could slow it down. What would you see? You would see the things, the perception that goes in, and then all the gaps where your brain, your mind, your conditioning is filling them up with something else. And that may be the only place where you can clean up because the world and reality is going to still keep throwing the things at you, right? It's not going to just go away. You may not be able to move them off the factory line of experience that's going inside, but that's going towards you. But what you're putting on that line, like piecing all the pieces together, that's the only thing that we can alter, right? From occurrence A, like something happens, right? I say hi, and then you say something back. There is an almost infinite space of possibilities of what you could be doing between those two interactions, right? The response. And that's what you want to increase the resolution, because suddenly instead of having one possibility of like, I say hi back, you can have two. You didn't say anything, you pause, you punch me. It keeps increasing, right? To the point where you see, that's what they say in all of these movies, like your possibilities are infinite. You're a being of infinite possibilities. For me, that's what it means. That even though it might still giving you, saying hi back or giving you a handshake or a hug or whatever, and it's three possibilities, all that happens between that to come to that point is infinite. And the more you can see how they chain together, the more free you are. Because even if you are limited towards, if the action at the end ends up looking the same to an outside observer, the process getting there is so rich that you would have so many opportunities for observing your patterns and the chain reaction that you're in a little adventure on your own. It's like number theory in maths, right? Like the infinite between 3 and 4 versus the infinite between 4 and 5, and then the infinites of non-rational numbers are compared to this infinite for rational number, etc. You could go into that infinite forever. And it's also like that between moments, even though it doesn't look like that. Is it worth it? Not really. Like we have to also live life and sometimes live on autopilot. But just to say that nothing is really as it seems. Well, it's so simple, you can always go deeper and deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. Deeper outside and inside, right? And I think really,
Yeah.
if there's something I need to remind myself all the time of, is really just try to be here and observe what is here. And I know everyone is on their own path, on their own journey. So what works for me or for you or for someone else, it does not necessarily work for someone listening to this right now, because you are on your own path. And sometimes it's just helpful getting some help from someone else, If you think you cannot make any progress, on the other hand, just slowing down a little bit and just observing, well, what is here, right? Even if you don't have super resolution in your perception, because I think Shinzen did train for many decades at this point, you might still, there is still some path to be able to observe what's here towards a path of like a little easing, let's say, right? No, not getting rid of everything, just having a little bit more peace, a little bit more understanding what's going on. So that's something I need to remind myself of all the time when I'm in the middle of, let's say, some painful debugging session or so, or maybe I lose the train, I miss the train, right? So that's usually what happens to me quite often because I'm trying to make it very close, too close, and then I missed a train, and then then I have to wait there. And this is a good exercise, actually, right? When it's really something annoying, and then you can ask yourself, okay, what is annoying there? Right? And you have to pay the price for yourself, and then sometimes you can't even have compassion with yourself, with your foolishness, and this is okay and great.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think we can end on that note, and hope this serves you all. And it was an interesting call. See ya, guys.
Yo, see ya.